Hello and welcome to this fifth video. I'm showing you my sketches of the London Monopoly Board properties. So we've had the pinks and the blues linked geographically but not thematically. Then we've had the oranges linked thematically, not geographically. And now with the reds, we're back to geography again. Now, heading east from Trafalgar Square towards St Paul's, you pass along the Strand, which becomes Fleet Street. So we begin with my sketch of the Strand. Now, many good things have come out of Germany, not the least of which is the original English language. It's not surprising, really, when you consider that the tribes settling England in the 5th, 6th and 7th centuries, the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes, were all from areas of what is now Germany. The language that they spoke, which we'll call Old English for simplicity's sake, was actually a dialect of Old German. And if you know modern German, well, you'll know that the word Strand is a German word which means beach. And this is also what it meant in Old English. After the Romans were recalled to Rome for good, Londinium, Roman London, was pretty much deserted. Now, that's the space within the old city walls, which is what we now refer to as the City of London. Over a period of time, an Anglo-Saxon trading settlement grew up along the banks of the Thames, extending from the shoreline, the beach, of the Thames from west of Londinium, and this settlement was called Londonwick. Now, in Anglo-Saxon times, the River Thames was much wider than it is now. The Strand is not very close to the northern bank of the Thames at all now, but that's relatively recent. At the height of Londonwick, the road we call the Strand was actually right by the shore, hence the name. In the late 9th century, King Alfred the Great ordered people out of Londonwick and into the old Roman city walls, into Old Londinium. But the Strand still remained an important thoroughfare and retained its name unchanged for well over 1,000 years. The Strand is part of the main route linking Westminster with the old City of London. It ends where the medieval city walls once stood, and this used to be marked by the gateway which is shown in this sketch, Temple Bar. It was designed by Sir Christopher Wren, and the relatively narrow gateways caused increasing traffic congestion through the late 18th and into the middle of the 19th century. So when the decision was made to build the new Royal Courts of Justice in the Strand, it was also decided to remove Temple Bar. It was very carefully taken down and bought by Lady Meux, M-E-U-X, Lady Meux, the wife of a brewing magnate, and erected in the grounds of their house, Theobald's Park. In fact, I did actually visit it in Theobald's Park in 2003, the very day before work to deconstruct it began. It was re-erected in the shadow of St Paul's just off Fleet Street, but we'll come to that. The Strand is home to many shops and theatres and a couple of beautiful churches, St Clement Danes, designed by Sir Christopher Wren, and St Mary le Strand, designed by Wren's protégé James Gibbs. The churches are known as island churches because they both stand on large traffic islands. Now, also on the Strand is Charing Cross Station. This marks the location of the last and grandest Eleanor Cross. The Eleanor Crosses were 12 lavishly decorated stone monuments, topped with crosses. King Edward I had them built in memory of his deceased wife, Eleanor of Castile. She died in the East Midlands, and a coffin was brought in ceremony to Westminster. So each cross marks a location where the coffin had rested for the night. 3 of them still remain. The one outside Charing Cross Station, however, is not one of them. The original Charing Cross was destroyed by Cromwell and his gang, and this is a Victorian replica. So if we walk up the Strand, just past St Clement Danes, we see the memorial plinth bearing a statue of a griffin holding the arms of the City of London. This marks where Temple Bar stood and shows that we're now in the second orange property, Fleet Street. So a little more Old English for you. The name of the street derives from the River Fleet, which is one of London's four lost rivers. Rivers that were all tributaries feeding into the Thames, but have been covered over the years. The word fleet derives from the Old English word fleot, F-L-E-O-T, which has several meanings, and one of which is stream. So in many ways, it's like the river. The Fleet ran in the open from Hampstead down through London to join the Thames. Fleet Street was originally called Fleet Bridge Street, since the road was bisected by the Fleet. By the 1870s, the whole course of the Fleet was covered over. Fleet Street runs up Ludgate Hill past St Paul's Cathedral. There are many interesting stories about St Paul's and its destruction in the Great Fire and subsequent rebuilding. You may have read Samuel Pepys' accounts of the fire, and very informative they are too. But if you're interested, have a look at John Evelyn's diary as well. I like the story that Christopher Wren visited the burnt out shell of the old cathedral and found a broken stone with the word resurgam, which of course means I will rise again. How prophetic. Fleet Street was also the home of the probably fictional Sweeney Todd, the barber who killed his customers and had them baked into pies. I say probably fictional. There have been some claims he was a real person, but there's nothing I've ever seen which would stand up in a court of law. During the 19th and especially the 20th century, Fleet Street became synonymous with the newspaper industry and was home to most of Britain's national newspapers. They've all moved out to pastures new now. Although the newspapers have gone, some printers still remain, maintaining an association with Fleet Street that actually goes back as far as 1500 AD, when a man called Wynkyn de Worde, the apprentice of England's first ever printer William Caxton, first set up his press there. So let's retrace our steps to the boss property, Trafalgar Square. So the name Trafalgar Square commemorates the 1805 Battle of Trafalgar. Now, where the square is now, once housed the Royal Mews stables, until King George IV moved the Mews to Buckingham Palace during the 1820s. John Nash, and we'll say a little bit more about him when we come to Regent Street, but John Nash was asked to develop the site, but he died, and after his death work progressed very, very slowly. By 1830 the plan was that the site was going to be called King William Square, after King William IV's accession that year. But finally, in 1835, which was the 30th anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar, it was decided to name the square Trafalgar Square and include a memorial to Nelson. My guess is that the owner of the square, King William IV, bearing in mind he was a brother officer and a personal friend of Nelson during his own time in the Navy, he must have approved. The square wasn't opened until 1844. Its most well-known feature is Nelson's column, a 145-foot tall Corinthian column, topped with Edward Hodges Bailey's statue of Nelson. Contrary to popular belief, the statue does not wear an eye patch. This has become one of London's most iconic and recognisable landmarks. The base of the statue is flanked by 4 pedestals, each bearing a bronze statue of a lion sculpted by Sir Edwin Landseer. Throughout its history, Trafalgar Square has seen a huge number of mass gatherings and demonstrations, and it kind of became the unofficial focus of London New Year celebrations. I remember dancing in the fountains on New Year's Eve in the early 80s very fondly. I remember the 2-hour walk home sopping wet much less fondly. During the early 80s, public transport just didn't run early on New Year's Day. The square is still home to a large number of pigeons. Up until the 21st century, feeding the pigeons in the square was looked on as an essential component of any tourist visit to London. Then people began to realise the public health risk of a gathering of 35,000 pigeons in such a small space. Feeding the pigeons has been banned since the early 2000s. There's 4 plinths which surround the square, and 3 of them have got permanent statues on them, showing George IV, General Charles Napier, and General Henry Havelock. The fourth plinth was unoccupied until the 21st century, since when it's been used for temporary displays of sculpture by some of the leading names in contemporary sculpture in the UK and the rest of the world. Right, you're going to have to forgive me for this, but I want to come back to Nelson. In July 2020, protesters in the city of Bristol pulled down a statue of the 17th and early 18th century trader Edward Colston. Now, the statue had originally been erected by a grateful city as a way of memorialising his charitable support of almshouses, churches, workhouses and schools. The protesters' argument was that in our modern multicultural Britain, glorifying a man who organised and greatly benefited from the slave trade, whatever he did to it with his money, is untenable. And I'm afraid to me that makes sense. Bearing in mind as well that the city authorities seem to have refused to enter even into discussion about this. Now, this action focused public attention on the question of public memorials to men associated with the slave trade, and Nelson's column became the subject of a public debate. It's a question which leads to very heated views on all sides. The older generation, as a rule, don't even want to discuss it, my mother and stepfather both being examples. But look, I'm a Londoner myself, okay? And I do get an emotional buzz whenever I see an iconic image of the city, like Nelson's column. But the thing is, symbols matter. Images matter. And the messages that they convey matter. Now, as I understand it, Nelson didn't own slaves himself. Okay. However, he was certainly opposed to William Wilberforce's campaign to abolish the slave trade, and he seems to have been very protective towards the slave-owning elite in the West Indies. Now, I'm not saying that this in itself means we should convict him and tear his statue down at once, but I'm very much saying it is at least the grounds for a constructive public debate on the subject. If Nelson was as great a hero as the defenders think he is, then his reputation is going to survive any amount of public debate. But if he wasn't, then we should certainly be discussing it. Well, we won't be discussing it in the next video. In that one, we'll be looking at the yellow set. Hope to see you then.